Wyoming Territory, August 1878. The cowboy rode out of the dust like a ghost, slumped in the saddle, his hat pulled low, his horse limping beneath him. From her front porch, Zadie Jensen saw him coming an hour before he reached her fence line. The sun was brutal that day, baking the earth until it cracked, and the wind carried nothing but grit. She narrowed her eyes, one hand shading her face, the other resting on the rifle propped against the porch rail. He did not look like trouble. He looked like he was barely hanging on. Zadie stepped down from the porch as he reached the gate, her boots crunching on dry dirt. He did not even tie off his horse. He just slid out of the saddle, legs buckling, and hit the ground hard. "Damn it," she muttered, rushing over. He was skin and bone under his coat, his face drawn tight with hunger and heat. His horse a dun mare with cracked hooves and a bleeding flank nickered weakly and nosed at the empty trough. Zadie looked from the man to the horse and back again. "What the hell happened to you two?" His lips moved, but nothing came out. She dragged him up by the arms, slung it over her shoulders, and half carried him into the house. She was strong for a woman who had done her share of surviving. She had not always lived alone, but the world had a way of stripping down what you thought was yours. She laid him on the settee, checked his pulse, then went back out to unhitch the saddle and lead the horse to the barn. There was not much left in her stores, but she filled a bucket with water and brought out an old tin of oats mixed with dried apples. The horse started eating like it was the first food it had seen in days. Inside, she boiled water and made a thin broth with potatoes and onions. Spoon fed it to the stranger until he stirred enough to swallow on his own. By the time night fell, his fever broke. He opened his eyes and blinked at the ceiling, then rolled his head toward her where she sat, needle in hand, mending a shirt by lamplight. "You fed my horse," he rasped. "And you," Zadie said without looking up. "You were halfway to dead, still might be, not on my watch." He studied her for a long moment. "Why?" She looked up then. "Because someone should have done the same for me once. No one did, so I do it now." He said nothing, just watched her with those sharp, tired eyes. She could not tell their color in the lamplight, maybe gray, maybe blue, but they were steady. "I am Xavier Langdon," he said after a while. "Zadie Jensen," she replied. "This is my land. You are safe here." He nodded once before falling back asleep. By the third day, Xavier was on his feet. He moved slow, but he was stronger than he had any right to be after coming in like that. He helped her muck the stalls, hauled water from the creek, and patched the porch rail without being asked. "You do not have to work," Zadie said as she handed him a tin cup of coffee one morning. "I do," he said simply, taking the cup. "You fed me, you fed my horse, I will earn it," and he did. Every day without complaint, quiet, steady, respectful, he never asked personal questions, never pushed past what she offered, but he listened when she talked. She told him about her two boys, Henley and Harris, who had been taken from her after her husband died in a mining collapse, and the courts decided she could not raise them properly on her own. She told him how she had written letters to the orphanage in Cheyenne every month for 2 years and never once got a reply. She stopped writing after that, but she never stopped setting 2 extra plates on the table each night, like maybe one day they would walk through the door. Xavier never said much when she talked about them. But one morning she found him in the barn, smoothing her youngest's name into the wood beam above the stall with the back of a knife. Just the first letter H, nothing more, but it stopped her heart for a moment. "You do not have to care," she said, voice catching. He turned his head. "I do." He stayed. Weeks passed. The land began to soften with the coming of cooler winds. The days shortened. Xavier built a new chicken coop, repaired the roof, and carved a saddle tree for her old mule. He never demanded thanks, and he never touched her unless she offered a hand first. But sometimes she caught his eyes on her when she was brushing her hair by the firelight, and when she did, he never looked away. One night they stood side by side on the porch, watching the stars come up. He had just finished fixing the fence line. She handed him a cup of whiskey and their fingers brushed. He did not pull away. "Why were you out there?" she asked finally. "What were you running from?" He let the silence settle before answering. "The war took my brothers. The railroad took the rest. I worked cattle until the ranch folded, got jumped by some boys in Montana for the last of my coin. They took my saddlebag, left me and my horse to die. Zadie looked at him. And now he turned to face her. Now I am here. She reached out, placed her palm against his chest. His heart beat steady under her hand. I do not want to be alone anymore, she whispered. He covered her hand with his. You are not. Her breath caught. She leaned in and he met her halfway. It was not hunger. It was not need. It was something quiet and deep and certain. His lips were warm. His hand cradled the back of her head like he had been waiting his whole life just to hold her still. She pulled back only enough to look into his eyes. Blue, not gray. You came starving, she said. I found what I needed, he said, and he kissed her again. The first frost came quiet, settled into the ground like a secret. Zadie woke to a thin crust of white on the windows and the smell of wood smoke tucked deep in the walls. She lit the stove, wrapped her shawl tighter, and found Xavier already outside, splitting kindling with slow, measured strikes. His coat was frayed at the cuffs now, and he'd taken to wearing a red wool scarf she'd found at the bottom of her cedar chest. He didn't speak when she joined him, only handed her the smaller logs to stack by the door. Creeks dropping, he said after a while. I can dig a line down to the root cellar, keep it from freezing solid. She nodded. I've been meaning to do that for 2 winters now. He looked up, breath rising in clouds. You've been alone too long. Zadie didn't answer. She bent to gather the last of the splinters and brushed past him into the house. Later that morning, she caught him in the lean-to, sorting through the tools. He held each one like it deserved a moment of thought: a rusted auger, a bent trowel, the old post-hole digger with one handle shorter than the other. She leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. His back was to her, but he must have known she was there. You ever work a forge? She asked. He glanced over his shoulder. I apprenticed to a blacksmith before the war, didn't last long. He drank too much and sold the anvil for whiskey. She stepped inside. I've got iron scraps and a bellows that still works. If you can fix tools, I can trade them to the Murphys for flour. He set the auger down gently. I can mend what's worth mending. That night, she watched from the corner of the barn as he coaxed flame into shape, the coals painting his face in red and shadow. The hammer rang steady against the makeshift anvil, sparks lifting into the dark like fireflies. She didn't speak, just listened. The sound filled something in her chest she hadn't known was hollow. 2 days later, she rode into town with a crate of repaired hinges, blades, and one retooled drawknife. When she returned, the porch had been swept clean and the door rehung without its old sag. Xavier stood beside the hearth, eyes flicking to her hands. Murphy's paid well, she said, setting down the flour sack. Tossed in salt and coffee too, he nodded once. Good, she stripped off her gloves, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. You could have gone with me. I figured you'd ask if you wanted me there. Zadie set the gloves aside. Folks in town still look at me like I'm something they stepped around. I'm not folks in town. She met his eyes. No, you're not. Each day after, the rhythm dug in deeper. He built a sled for hauling firewood and patched the quilt on her bed without a word about it. She found a worn volume of Longfellow on the shelf and left it by his side of the table one evening. He read a poem aloud over supper, his voice low and careful. She didn't tell him it made her throat ache. Early one morning, she returned from checking the trap line to find a shape moving slow along the ridge above the pasture. She squinted into the pale light, heart thudding. When the figure slumped forward and slid down the far side, she dropped the sack of rabbits and ran. Xavier caught up to her halfway up the slope, rifle in hand, his breath quick. Saw it from the barn, he said. They crested the hill together. A boy lay curled near the rocks, boots worn to holes, his face pinched with cold. He couldn't have been more than 10. Zadie knelt beside him, pressing fingers to his neck. Alive, she whispered. Xavier crouched beside her. He yours? No, she said, voice tight, but he's someone's. They carried him down between them, wrapped in Xavier's coat. By nightfall, the boy had taken broth and fallen into a fevered sleep in the loft bed. Zadie sat vigil while Xavier chopped more wood, his boots echoing through the hard ground outside. When he came in, she didn't turn from the boy. He's got bruises, old ones. Xavier stood beside her, silent. I'll send word to the schoolhouse in Laramie, she said. They'll know if anyone's been missing. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, and if no one claims him, she looked up then, eyes rimmed red. Then he stays. Xavier nodded. Outside, the wind scraped across the windows. Inside, the boy breathed slow and shallow. Zadie pulled the quilt tighter around him. When she stood, Xavier didn't move away as she stepped close. Her hand found his, calloused and familiar. You don't have to say anything, she said. I wouldn't know where to start. She rested her head against his shoulder. Then just stay. I will, he said. As long as you'll have me, and he did. By late October, the boy had a name, Elias, and a habit of waking before dawn to watch the barn from the kitchen step, wrapped in a wool blanket like a sentinel. He spoke little, but his eyes tracked everything. Xavier's movements as he rolled fence wire, Zadie's hands as she stitched patches into his shirt, the way they worked beside each other without needing many words. He didn't ask where he was or why no one had come. He didn't ask to leave either. One morning, as sunlight spilled pale across the frost, Elias stood at the barn door while Xavier adjusted the new harness on the mule. Is it always cold here? Elias asked, voice rough from sleep. Xavier didn't look up. Colder come December. You'll want thicker socks. The boy nodded once, then shuffled closer. You gonna stay, long as I'm wanted? Elias watched him tie off the strap. She wants you. Xavier paused, the leather taut in his grip. You sure? Yeah, Elias said. She doesn't look lonely when you're around. The boy turned and walked back toward the house. Xavier stayed where he was, one hand resting on the mule's shoulder until the clouds shifted and the sun struck his face. Inside, Zadie was packing dried corn into sacks for winter storage, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She looked up as he stepped in. Elias says you'll need better socks, she said. I'll manage, Xavier replied, brushing hay from his coat. He's sharp. He watches everything. Doesn't miss much. She tied off a sack and leaned her weight into the knot. He's still waiting for someone to come, even if he won't say it. He trusts you, she met his eyes. I want to give him reason to. The stove ticked as it cooled. Wind sighed against the walls. Xavier glanced toward the loft, then lowered his voice. I've been thinking about building on. Small room off the back. He shouldn't sleep above the kitchen forever. Zadie didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, stared out past the corral to where the wind had stripped the cottonwoods bare. You'd stay through spring then, she asked. If you'll have me, she turned. I already do. He crossed the room, slow but certain. His hand found hers, rough fingers curling around her knuckles. I've got nothing to go back to, he said, but here this feels like something I could build. She stepped closer, their foreheads nearly touching. This isn't charity, Xavier. You've earned every piece of it. He kissed her then, gentle and sure like the first time, but deeper now, not just with want, but with the weight of all they'd built between them. Later that day, they hitched the mule and rode into the edge of the hills where the soil held more clay. Xavier surveyed the ground, boots planted firm, and pointed to a rise near the tree line. Good spot for a root cellar, he said. Close to the house, high enough not to flood, Zadie studied the line of the land. And the new room, west side, sun'll warm it by midday, she nodded. We'll start before the ground hardens. They worked in silence after that, marking the earth with stakes and twine. Elias sat cross-legged nearby, whittling a sliver of pine. He didn't speak, but Zadie saw the way he looked at the two of them like he'd begun to believe, just a little, that this might be his place too. That evening, after supper, Zadie pulled a bundle from the cupboard. Wool trousers, a flannel shirt, boots a size too big but serviceable. I stitched the hem, she said, holding it out to Elias, for when you're ready to help outside. He took the bundle without a word, but his fingers clung to the fabric. You're part of this now, she said softly, not because you have to be. Because we want you to be. He nodded once, then carried the clothes up the ladder and laid them out beside his pallet like they were something sacred. That night, as the wind curled around the eaves and the fire settled low, Zadie stood at the window, arms folded. He's still afraid, she said. So was I, Xavier replied, coming up behind her, but not anymore. She leaned back into him, the warmth of his chest steady at her spine. His arms circled her, strong and quiet. Then we keep building, she said, One day at a time, we will. And they did. The air had turned sharp by the time Xavier finished framing the new room. The timbers were rough, cut from pine he and Elias hauled down from the north ridge, and the joints bore the mark of deliberate hands, each notch fitted without waste, each peg driven flush. Zadie stood in the doorway one afternoon, watching Xavier chisel a sill plate against the light. The wind tugged strands of hair loose from her braid, but she didn't tuck them back. "You ever build a house before?" she asked. Xavier straightened, wiping sawdust from his shirt. "Just fence lines and lined shacks, nothing meant to hold a family." She stepped over the threshold. "This is." He looked at her, then not quick, not shy, just steady. "I know," he said. Later that day, Elias came down from the fields dragging a rabbit snare with a fresh catch. He didn't say anything, just handed it to Zadie, and she nodded approval. He stood a little taller after that. Over supper, the boy spoke up without prompting. "There was a church in the town I came from, whitewashed, with a bell. They'd ring it when someone got married." Xavier passed him the bread. "You ever hear it ring?" Elias shook his head, chewing. "Just saw the rope hanging once." Zadie folded her hands on the table. "We don't have a bell." "Don't need one," Xavier said. Elias tilted his head. "Then how would people know?" Xavier glanced toward Zadie. "They'd know." She didn't look away. "They'd know." The next morning, she found Xavier standing in the unfinished room, holding a folded scrap of paper. The handwriting was tight and slanted, worn at the creases. "I wrote this years ago," he said, not turning. "To no one, just needed to say things." She crossed to him. "May I?" He handed it over. The paper was dry and yellowing. She read it once, then folded it again and slid it into her pocket. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "I know." They didn't speak of it again. That week, the wind drove in heavy from the north, and the first snowfall came sudden. It lay quiet and deep, muffling the world in white. They worked by lamplight for 2 days to finish the roof, Elias ferrying nails and boards, his boots crunching through the drift. When it was done, they stood inside together, the three of them, staring up at the rafters. Zadie turned to Xavier. "You've given more than I asked. You gave me place," he said. "This is just shape to it." Elias kicked at a curl of sawdust. "When it's warm again, can we plant something out back?" Zadie smiled. "We will." That night the wind howled, but the house held strong. Inside, the fire glowed low, and Elias slept under a new quilt Zadie had pieced from old shirts and flour sacks. Xavier sat carving a yoke pin by the hearth while Zadie stitched buttons onto a flannel collar. "You ever think about what you'd do if you hadn't come here?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I'd be gone by now." She set the thread aside. "So would I." He laid the pin down and turned to her. "I want this to be permanent." "It already is," she said. He took her hand, and they didn't speak again that night. By the time the snow had crusted hard enough to walk on, they'd moved the bed into the new room and hung a curtain for Elias across the loft. The boy took to reading by the window in the morning light, a habit Xavier never commented on, but always seemed to make room for. One afternoon, Xavier came in from the smokehouse smelling of hickory and handed Zadie a wrapped bundle. She opened it slowly. Inside was a carved box, small and smooth, with her initials burned into the lid. "You made this," he nodded, "for your letters. If you ever want to write them again," her throat tightened, "I might. Then they should have a place." She reached up, brushed a hand across his jaw. "So should you." He leaned into her touch, eyes closed. "I already do." Outside, the snow softened under the sun. Inside, the warmth held. The life they had built stood firm, and nothing in it felt borrowed. The thaw came slow that year. Ice clung to the edges of the roof well into March, and the creek didn't run full until the 3rd week. But the earth softened, and when it did, Zadie planted onions in neat rows, her hands in the soil while Xavier built the gate that would keep the deer out. Elias watched from the tree stump, chewing on a twig and sketching lines in the dirt with his heel. By April, the sun lingered longer each day, and the smell of turned earth drifted through the windows. Zadie had taken to leaving them open in the afternoons, letting the breeze lift the curtains as she shelled peas or sorted seed. The house held a new rhythm, now not one of survival, but of tending, of care. Xavier came in one evening, trousers damp to the knee, and dropped a canvas sack near the hearth. Traded with the men riding out from Rock Creek, he said. They had barley seed and a hand cultivator. Gave him the yoke pin and a brace hook. Zadie wiped her hands on her apron. You gave away your work. I gave away what we had extra, seemed fair. She poured him coffee, black and hot. Then I'll plant the barley tomorrow. He took the cup and held it between both palms. There's a man named Perkins, rides through Rock Creek with a dry goods wagon. Said he'd seen a boy matching Elias's description months back with a woman, but he was too far off to be sure. Zadie leaned against the table. You think it was him? Could be. But he didn't seem to know much beyond that. Elias came down the ladder just then, rubbing his eyes with the back of his wrist. He stopped when he saw them watching him. You're not sending me off anywhere, he said, voice flat but quiet. No, Zadie said. You're home. Xavier added nothing, but he set a third plate at the table without being asked. In May, they dug a second plot behind the house for beans and squash. Elias helped mark the rows with twine, and Zadie taught him to press seeds with the flat of his thumb. Xavier pulled stones from the far field and laid them into a low wall along the edge of the pasture. One afternoon, Zadie found a bundle wrapped in cloth on the bed. Inside was a dress simple, cream-colored cotton, hand-stitched at the cuffs and collar. She turned to find Xavier by the door, hat in hand. I know it's not store-bought, he said, but I thought it might suit you. She ran her fingers over the seams. You made this? Used your measurements from the coat you hung behind the door. She stepped to him, holding the dress between them. Why? Because I want to stand beside you, he said. Not just in the field or by the fire, I want you to know that. Her voice was steady. Then ask me, he set the hat aside. Will you be my wife, Zadie? She didn't hesitate. Yes. The sun lit the window behind her, and for a moment the room held nothing but stillness. Then she reached for him, and he met her in the middle. They were married 2 weeks later, beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. No preacher, no crowd, just them, Elias standing between them, holding the carved box with the folded paper inside. Zadie wore the dress, and Xavier had washed the dust from his boots. They spoke their vows soft but sure, and when they kissed, the world narrowed to the space between them. Afterward, they shared coffee and cornbread on a quilt spread over the grass. Elias found a bird's feather and tucked it behind Zadie's ear. She laughed, and it caught in her throat from the quiet joy of it. That summer, the barley ripened gold, and the squash vines curled thick along the fence. Elias learned to ride the mule bareback, and Xavier built him a slingshot from buckthorn and hide. Zadie took to drying herbs along the rafters and writing again letters to no one, folded neatly and tucked into the box. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, the three of them. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The house stood strong. The land held firm. And everything they needed was there. Years later, when the roof needed re-shingling and Elias was tall enough to reach the rafters himself, travelers passing through would stop just long enough to ask who lived there. They'd point to the man hammering a brace into the barn wall, the woman handing him a cloth to wipe his brow, and the boy sorting seed from chaff with sun-rough hands. That's the Langdons, the neighbors would say. Hard folks, kind too. Built everything they have with their own hands. And it would be true, because love, when earned slow and tended every day, doesn't fade, it roots deep, it holds, and it lasts.